7 months in, Syria's post-Assad transition has achieved remarkable progress when it comes to issues like international diplomacy, recognition, and integration into the international community. And most recently, that progress has resulted in Syria's economic openings by way of sanctions relief, investment, and a flurry of new investment deals amounting in the billions of dollars. But while Syria's external recovery has made great strides, the situation inside the country remains unstable and precarious. While Syria faces significant challenges from the likes of ISIS, a latent anti-government insurgency, the rise of vigilante justice, at the structural level, the continued control of sizable amounts of Syrian territory by actors that oppose integration into the new state is a potentially existential challenge for the transitional government. A week ago, a landmark and unprecedented summit was held in Damascus between the Syrian Democratic Forces, who control 25% of Syria in the northeast, and the government. And that was brought together by American and French mediation. But the summit failed, with most of the SDF's conditions on integration hardening and some even annulling progress that had been made in prior negotiations. And that led to a spike in tensions, but no conflict, at least until now. But only 2 days after that summit, Syria's other somewhat disconnected territory, the southern Druze majority province of Sweida, collapsed into horrific violence. And 5 days later, several hundred people, mostly combatants but also large numbers of civilians, lie dead. And as with all things Syria, how it started, what happened, and what it means is complicated. It all began late at night on July 11th, when a handful of Bedouin gunmen stopped a vegetable truck travelling from Damascus into Sweida, beating the Druze driver and stealing the truck and its contents. The following morning, on July the 12th, Druze militiamen in Sweida kidnapped 8 Bedouin men in retaliation, prompting Bedouin gunmen to then kidnap 5 Druze men in response. As the provincial notables and other important figures sought to resolve this emerging hostage crisis, tensions surged, with both sides kidnapping even more of each other's brethren. Now, at this point, it's important to acknowledge that tensions and occasional hostilities between Sweida's Bedouin and Druze communities date back many, many years, mostly linked to the now rife drugs trade in the area, control of smuggling routes, and land disputes. But this latest sudden escalation was additionally charged in Syria's post-Assad transitional environment, in which some of Sweida's Druze militias have stalwartly refused to integrate into the new Syria. The region's Bedouins, on the other hand, do seek integration, and to make things additionally complicated, so too do some other Druze militias. As it happens, Sweida's witnessed at least 4 similar sudden bouts of localized fighting since January this year, but this time around has been different. So back to recent events in Sweida. By the morning of July the 13th, local negotiations had collapsed and violence exploded. Druze areas were shelled, Bedouin areas were shelled, and by the end of the day, at least 30 people were dead and more than 100 injured. Now, by this point, Syria's transitional government was uninvolved. It has had no real presence in Sweida, after all. But on July the 14th, the following day, the government declared that it was intervening to, in its words, intervene and establish order. But within minutes of crossing into Sweida, Syrian soldiers were ambushed by Druze militiamen. 10 men were surrounded and executed, their bodies piled up on the side of the road and used for celebratory photographs by Druze militiamen. 8 other soldiers were stripped into their underwear and marched to a nearby village where they were then killed. And that incident alone poured fuel onto an already simmering fire. Government forces declared their intent to enforce state authority by taking control of the whole province. But in so doing, government forces came up against an array of Druze militias, chief among them the Sweida Military Council. Now, this is a militia that was established just 24 hours after Assad's fall, and which answers primarily to a Druze cleric called Hikmat al-Hijri. Now, half of the Sweida Military Council's leadership are former Assad regime officers, and the core of the Assad-era drugs trade in southern Syria is coordinated primarily through Sweida Military Council channels. In fact, the Jordanian military intercepted 2 drug smuggling attempts from Sweida across the Jordanian border whilst all of this fighting was raging nearby. So with that fighting raging, Israel then militarily intervened in support of Druze forces. Israel's initial demand at the time was that Syria's military should withdraw its armoured vehicles or tanks from Sweida. But once they had been withdrawn, Israeli strikes then expanded to include targeting pickup trucks and frontline ground troops. By midday on July 15th, a ceasefire was agreed between the government and Sweida's Druze, Christian and civil leaders. The deal at the time called on government forces to establish control and security, paving the way for talks to determine the province's future. 30 minutes after that ceasefire was announced, al-Hijri announced his rejection of it, ordering his fighters to resume hostilities. 9 near-simultaneous ambushes of government forces then occurred, as Israeli airstrikes also resumed. And amidst that sudden rejection of what appeared to be a calm down, chaos ensued. Retaliatory attacks and killings targeting Druze civilians did take place, with monitors confirming at least 20 civilian deaths that day. On July 16th, the following day, fighting continued. Despite Israel's escalating air campaign, government forces continued to advance. In fact, they took the provincial capital and the hilltop suburb of Qanawat, which is home to Hikmet al-Hijri's compound and his headquarters. When that happened, Israeli airstrikes hit the Syrian Ministry of Defense in Damascus, as well as the grounds of the presidential palace and a number of military bases across southern Syria. Now, not long after those unprecedented strikes, and we should note that Israel never struck Syrian ministries under Assad's time in power, a second, comprehensive and even more detailed ceasefire and security agreement was announced by Sweida's religious and civil leaders and by the government. That deal called on local internal security forces to take control, in coordination with the government's interior ministry, in addition to other things like restoring state service provision, investigating crimes, securing roadways and more. But again, roughly 30 minutes later, Hikmet al-Hijri announced his rejection of the deal and told his fighters to continue to resist, and this time an even more intense round of Israeli airstrikes then ensued, while Sweida's other Druze leaders began issuing public condemnations of Hijri, accusing him of seeking to monopolize leadership and, in one case, of being a, quote, subversive agent seeking to divide Syria. As this chaotic situation grew increasingly desperate, intensive diplomacy by the United States, Turkey and Arab states secured a third ceasefire late on July 16th. And per the terms of that deal, government forces would withdraw entirely from Sweida, while specific Druze forces would be assigned security responsibility. Now, government forces did indeed withdraw entirely that night, but by the morning, Hikmet al-Hijri's militia had led the takeover of Sweida city, some of them flying Druze flags, with the Israeli Star of David added. The Druze forces that the ceasefire had assigned responsibility to were nowhere to be seen. By midday on July the 17th, reports began to emerge of Bedouin men, women and children having been executed by Druze gunmen. Large-scale Bedouin displacement began towards the neighbouring province of Deraa, where tribes in Deraa but also in other places in Syria began mobilising men, seeking to send them to Sweida to fight back. And by late on July the 17th, Bedouin and tribal forces inside Sweida had begun a new campaign aimed at recapturing areas from Druze militias. This recent chapter of events has opened up a hornet's nest in Syria. When Ahmad al-Shara walked into Damascus in December last year, he declared that he was giving Syria back to its people, a vast majority of whom seek a reunification of the country under some form of strong central leadership in Damascus. With the SDF resisting integration in the northeast, and with a clearly now Israeli-backed Druze bastion emerging in Sweida, Syria's decades-old, deeply ingrained grievances, driven in some cases by political, ethnic and religious differences, are all at risk of detonating. Without aggressive and consistent international diplomacy, Syria's otherwise promising transition and recovery risks collapsing into a renewed and bitter civil conflict.